Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art at Portland State University. This is Linda Tessner. I'm the interim director and curator for the JSMA at PSU. On March 5th, the JSMA opened 2 new exhibitions, R.V. Smith, 2 Up and 2 Back, and Daniel Duford, John Brown's Vision from the Scaffold. And, like every other museum and gallery around the world, by March 13th we had to shutter our doors due to COVID-19. We quickly pivoted and posted RV's and Daniel's exhibitions online. You can view their exhibitions at pdx.edu/museum-of-art. In lieu of the exhibition programming that we had planned, we offer this virtual gallery talk with Daniel Duford. In 2017, Duford was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship based on this new body of work. Duford's interest in John Brown history evolved out of his 2017 artist residency in Waterford, Virginia. A visit to Harper's Ferry piqued Duford's interest in John Brown and eventually led Duford to think about the power of historical narrative painting as a means to think critically about the contemporary social and political landscape. Thank you to Daniel Duford, Eric Mellencamp, and Emily Stennis for bringing this gallery talk to you. I greatly look forward to welcoming you back to the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art at PSU as soon as we can reopen.
So, in these portraits that I've done, I have taken on really traditional portraiture, but I have stripped it of the kind of heroic associations you normally see in depictions of John Brown. So, there's some famous ones of him where he is, larger than life, and I wanted to have an intimacy with the subject. I wanted there to be a sense that I'm looking at this person, and so when you, the viewer, come, you're looking at them too. So in the portrait Brown family, all present, when you're looking at all the family members who are there, in the background, there is, his one son who got away and lived to be an old man. No one else got to have that kind of future. So what I wanted to do in that is to depict him at the last moment of his life. So obviously that's an anachronistic portrait, and he is holding a sacrificial lamb whose throat he's just cut. And in the background, outside the window, is the storm, the tornado, which is a reference to their time in Kansas and the bleeding Kansas and the Osawatomie Brown days, but it's also about the storm that is kicked up after this happens. But I also wanted the intimacy of the portraiture. This is his family. This is his family who, he loved, but he also sacrificed. And what I wanted to happen with this, again, was to have a sense of intimacy with the sitter and with the viewer. And what I hope happens is that there's a humanity that comes through and a feeling of like they are looking at you and you are looking at them, and they are alive and they are present right here. So what is it that what is it that they mean to you? What are they saying to you from the past? What is it we need to hear? In the case of the co-conspirators, and that painting, we have the 5 African American men who went with Brown. The interesting thing about the raid on Harper's Ferry was that he actually had he was beloved by many in the radical abolitionist community, African Americans, because they saw here is a white man who is willing to die and to put his family's life on the line for someone else who is seen as the most despised in the culture, in the society, and he's willing to do this. But it was really hard to get them to get enough people to actually join him. For one reason, his plan was super shadowy and secret. For another, he right before the raid, he met in Maryland, actually in Pennsylvania with Frederick Douglass, his friend, and they met in an abandoned quarry, and they said, he said, I want you to come with me, Frederick. You can help hive the bees, meaning, once you've released all these people, they're going to come into him and hive, or actually gather around Frederick Douglass. But Douglass didn't. He said, you shouldn't do this. It's a trap. You're making a steel trap. So a lot of people saw they believed in him in spirit, but they didn't want to go with him. And there was already a lot of distrust, kind of racial distrust. So these are the 5 men who went with him, and I wanted to depict them again in a living room. I wanted them to be somewhat modern. That they're all here. They're all looking at you, the viewer. So this approach to portraiture that I used is one in which I am not so interested in the heroic historical depiction, but what is human and what is present now. I mentioned that John Brown became a presence as an absence. I became really interested in who was around him. Was it, Frederick Douglass or many of the other abolitionists, and so those became the kind of like the growth around this idea of John Brown. John Brown is actually someone who shows up a lot in art. And I think it's because he could be interpreted in many ways and many times. He was one of the people who, W.E.B. Du Bois was asked to write the biography of a great American. Given all of his work, he probably would have chosen an African American. He chose John Brown because of the fact that he laid his life down for African Americans. But there's poems, there's The Good Lord Bird, there's Fire in the Mountain by Terry Besson, which is a speculative history in which John Brown is successful. He actually carries out his raid with Harriet Tubman in July instead of October, and they successfully pull off the Civil War, except the Civil War in this case is started by the enslaved and these freedom fighters, and the novel takes place in 1959 at the centennial of the raid on Harper's Ferry, and now much of the South is called Nova Africa. The Cherokee have their own nation, and what was once the United States is this small northern place, and there's a character in there who says, because there's a book in the fake history called John Brown's Body, which actually tells our real history, and the character who reads it says, that's absurd. Why would the Civil War started by the slave powers? Like, they would have just wanted things to return to normal. That's kind of how things happen. And so that idea of a speculative history, or he as a symbol of something, of a kind of fire, a kind of determination to to stop a system that makes us all feel like there's no way out. And so he was someone, as I said before, I don't know why I got caught by him. I was just in Harper's Ferry. I just was going, I knew about him, and there was something that at that moment felt very present. Stephen Vincent Benet's book, John Brown's Body, was one of the best-selling long-form poems of its time. And John Brown only makes up the first couple of books, so it's a book-length thing. It's really about the Civil War, and the American soul. The Good Lord Bird by James McBride, which is one of my favorite novels, is really about John Brown's being sort of on the pivot of, is he insane? Is he a user? Is he a hero? It's never quite clear. And so I feel like he, as a image, as a history, and as a person, created this kind of gravity around him, and a series of stories comes out of that. And it's present right now because we are in very dire times. And we are in a time where the beliefs of that slave power are not only ascendant, but they're quickly eroding any of the small gains that were made in the civil rights movement and all of this history. So it's absolutely important to know this history, but also know it as a potent image. For this show, I work in 3 different media, and I didn't really start out with that as my main intention. The first paintings I did were watercolors. This is one of a terrible Swiss sword. This was done in Waterford that first time, where I was just trying to figure out, what is this imagery? I don't even know what I'm doing with this imagery. I don't know what it is about this story. I've barely just begun to learn about it. And so I was working on watercolor is quick. I love the layering of it. I love the jewel-like aspect of it. I love the quickness. My hand in particular is, works well with watercolor. So that, and it's also portable. So I was doing those watercolors, and my intention was always to do pretty, ambitious oil paintings. But I went and I did a residency at the McDowell Colony where I did the 3 big watercolors. Those were kind of a revelation. I did those because I was at the McDowell Colony. I knew I didn't want to ship a bunch of paints. I wanted to work pretty quickly, and I happened to have that big watercolor, and those became kind of a revelation for me. When I did those, it was like something happened in what the imagery was trying to tell me. Whatever was coming through came out in those watercolors. And I also did these while I was at the McDowell Colony. So watercolors seem to be the main medium, but I still had a desire to work in oil, and I began to work in oil. So the big oil painting, which is and this is oil, by the way. This is one of the earlier paintings. Abolitionists in a Flood. That too there was something there. Each of the medium has a voice, and it has a cadence, and it has something in the way it wants to be said. The watercolor does something that is light and opens up. The oil color there's something in the glow of that pigment in the medium of the oil that I just absolutely love. What had happened though, I was working on this big oil painting, and I started to not feel very good because of the solvents. And I had just completed a really big cycle of 8-foot long paintings in acrylic, which is how I often work when I do public art murals. I use acrylic. So I went back to acrylic to do these big paintings because I could also work as fast as I could with the watercolor. I thought that was and I really like what was happening with those. So when I returned to when I was going to do the tree time divinations, I was looking at these small things. I thought I can actually. I'm trying out new ways to work without solvent. And I think I could do that small and try that out. And then something magical happened for me in those little paintings. They were like little jewels, and there's this depth. And so I think each of those mediums was doing something. There's a kind of color intensity and a quickness in scale that I was able to get out of the acrylic. But then there's something in the intimacy and the kind of materiality of the oil of the tree time divinations that were really fantastic. So that's why I work with all three of those, because each one offers something a little bit different. And again, if you think of them like, what does a short story do? What does a novel do? What does an essay do? Sometimes you have to you have to kind of play with all of those. Or what is a poem, fiction and essay. But sometimes it really is just a matter of what is the speed of it and what is the scale. So, tree time divinations were the last paintings to be done in the series, and I'd already mentioned that I haven't. I've kind of gotten this interest in tarot cards in the last few years, and I think about tarot cards in a number of ways. One is this image world that sparks something in your subconscious. And then the idea of divinatory or prophetic imagery, which you can look at and it can open up another way of seeing. So I wanted to speak to the idea of tree time. Tree time or deep time is something that is being talked about popularly in things like novels like The Overstory, in The Secret Language of Trees, the Songs of Trees. There seems to be as if the trees are waking us up to even thinking of the Ents and the Lord of the Rings. That's opening us up to a sense that we used to have. We used to have this mythologically. We used to have this culturally of the deep, abiding history of trees, the lives of trees, and how they connect to something much bigger. So when I started this project, as I've mentioned in other parts of this talk, I didn't want to do just a historical research project. I wanted to do something that connected into deep time. And in order to do that, we have to take into account the landscape itself and the trees. So when I started the tree time divinations, I wanted to think of them as the way I began thinking about was the story of the scaffold through its material, which is a tree. So the scaffold's made of lumber. It's milled, it's cut, it's grown, going backwards. But then you start to think about the scaffold and you think about all the other ways in which the American forests have been felled for what's called progress for what is the economic system, which is the slave system, the colonial system, the very things that John Brown was fighting against, for which he was being hung for interrupting. I mean, part of what he was being hung for was not so much that he was a radical abolitionist, it was that he was interrupting the private property of a capitalist state. And so if you begin to think of the trees as a living entity, if you think of it in an indigenous way, where the trees, you owe something to the trees, you can't just take them. If you're going to take them, you have to be allowed to do so. You have to have some other relationship with them. So it began just from seed to scaffold. But it began to expand from there, and they do start to feel like little tiny portals that were inserted, almost as if you were to go back into the painting of the co-conspirators, where you see the Amistad. And on the Amistad, which is a tall masted ship, you start to think of the mast pines, which were, massive forests were felled to create merchant armies and military ships to further this project of colonialism. So and to start to think of those little images, these small moments in comics, it's called aspect to aspect. If you're telling a story and you want to just tell a story in which, maybe a character is sitting there and you want to slow time down in the narrative and just give a sense of the atmosphere, you might have a panel where there's just puddles of water, maybe a window. These are scene setting images, but they slow time down. So I wanted to do that in these panels, is to slow time down and to have these little divinatory moments from the life of the forest, to remember that the forest is alive. The wood making the scaffold, the wood making the railroad tracks, the clear cut, and then the song of the cicadas. If you go to the East Coast, that song in the summer is part of the soundtrack of that, and the cicadas are timed by 13 to 15, 17 years. They come out over long periods of time, so they have a different sense of time. The image of the railroad support, the bridge support that's in Harper's Ferry on the Potomac, with the tree growing out of it, that to me is a tree time moment, where this bridge, which was once part of this idea of progress, has become obsolete. Now, obviously, there's another bridge there, but now there's something growing out of it. Now there's a new life growing out of it. So those tree time paintings are really like little windows, little portals, divinatory portals, prophetic images that are peeks back into deep time and bring us back up to the present. So I'm going to start with a painting called The Warriors, the Three Sisters. So in that painting, I've depicted 5 of the women who were instrumental in the abolitionist movement and the suffragette movement. These were women who, like women activists today, who are often overlooked, who are instrumental to the movement. And had they been listened to then, we would have had a voting rights amendment that included women much earlier. But the way I wanted to depict them was that they were sitting, looking fiercely at you, the viewer, and bringing you, the viewer, into their conversation and making it present. So There's in the front, there's Mary Ann Shadd, who was a writer, abolitionist writer, and editor. Very rare for an African American woman to be either of those things, and so she's holding a newspaper. Behind her are the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina, and one of them is holding the sword, which you'll see in many of the other paintings. And then behind them are the Harriet Fortin and Charlotte Fortin, and then Sojourner Truth. So they actually all traveled in the same circle, and they all were aware of each other. There was a network that they were aware of each other. The Grimke sisters were interesting because they came from a slaveholding family, and they rejected their past. They rejected their inheritance, and they went on to become really powerful abolitionists and suffragettes. In the background is a traditional Iroquois garden called the Three Sisters, and it's a principle of planting that was indigenous to the Northeast, where the Three Sisters are corn, beans, and squash, because they all support each other. And I thought of this. There's a couple of reasons for including that. One is that there was a famous meeting in Seneca where the Seneca were famously matrilineal, and they still are, and they influenced a lot of these ideas in the movement about the hierarchy of a culture. And then there's this idea of the agriculture as a nurturing place, a place that is supportive. And so I wanted to include all of those references within that painting. The Secret Six is a portrait of the six men who backed John Brown's raid in Harper's Ferry. Now, originally, they had an inkling of what he was going to do, but originally many of his financial backers thought that he was taking these resources and going to Kansas, where the front lines of the battle over the Free State versus the expansion of the slave state was playing out, and where John Brown kind of came to the consciousness of the United States. So in this portrait, you have the co-conspirators. You have Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Samuel Gridley Howe, George Luther Stearns, Garrett Smith, and Franklin Sanborn. And each of them were wealthy. Each of them had different relationships to John Brown and to what was called radical abolitionism. And so, as I've said in some of these other talks, I have this idea. I'm going to do a group portrait of the six of them sitting together in a room, as if they were sitting for me. Something's going to be happening outside the window. And so it's not until I'm in the painting process where I start to understand what needs to be happening outside the window, what is in that particular landscape. So in this case, what I did was I start to think about the implications of what they want. They wanted to stop the slave state, and they were pushing to end slavery. And effectively that happened after the Civil War, except then we have the carceral state, the carceral state, and we have chain gangs in which prisoners are picking cotton. So incarcerated adults are picking cotton. So the image in the background comes from a Texas chain gang that actually has incarcerated adults picking cotton, mostly African American. So there is, in effect, no end to the slave state. And so this painting suddenly, that went out into the background, the movement of Garrett Smith in the back, where he's beginning to pull down the shade, it just sort of came. I just saw that this. So I'm not sure if he's pulling the shade up or down. I'll leave that to you to think about. But that is a way. There is something happening of the secrecy of their backing, and the way each of them, after it was exposed, how some of them responded, where they doubled down, where they were going to break John Brown out of prison. Some of them feigned madness. Some of them were out of the country. So that is, again, that's up to your conversation with them as you look at the painting. John Brown on the Scaffold, John Brown's vision on the Scaffold, the watercolor, was the first of the series where things began to crystallize. I did it while I was in residency at the McDowell Colony in New Hampshire, right in the landscape of the Transcendentalist, right in the landscape of where the Secret Six were, where John Brown was coming to meet with sympathetic thinkers of the time. It was the hotbed of radical abolitionism. And so while I was there, the large watercolor, I was trying to think about, how am I going to approach the subject? Am I going to approach the subject as a history project? Is it going to be simply a retelling of the facts? Is it going to be biography, or is it going to be something else? And I began to take my cues from different writers like Octavia Butler, who wrote Kindred, and writers like James McBride, who wrote Good Lord Bird, and Terry Bisson, who wrote Fire in the Mountain. So these are sort of speculative fictions and these weavings of past and present. So when I began that, I had always thought about the moment on the scaffold when John Brown is waiting, and he's waiting there with the hood, and he's waiting there with the noose, and he is waiting for the soldiers to line up. In that 10 minutes, what's going through his mind? We have no idea. So in this is the opening. This is the portal through which this idea of deep past and deep present begin to come together through this idea of the vision of John Brown. So in the drawing, there's a blue heron and there's a great tree, but then you also see Joseph Cinque of the Amistad, and you see Nat Turner who led a slave revolt, and was a huge influence on John Brown. And then you see Robert E. Lee, who was part of the United States Army when he arrested John Brown, and then became the leader of the Confederacy, and then later, inexplicably, even now, as a traitor to the country, is treated as a hero. So in that, I start to see this was the moment where I saw this is what this work is going to be about. The wall drawing, John Brown's body, is meant as a kind of a book cover almost for the entire exhibition. If you thought of the exhibition as a way where there are groupings of things, there are the still lifes, there are the 3 watercolors, there's the portraits, then there's tree time divinations, and then you have this landscape, which is the outside world. The wall drawing, though, is there to encapsulate many of these ideas. So in this, you have the body of John Brown underground, and out of that is growing a great tree. John Brown's body was the rally cry, the song that the Union Army sang during the Civil War. And there's a line, John Brown's body is a moldering in the grave. So there's this idea of the body itself moldering, but his truth keeps marching on. And, there's this swift sword. And so in the wall drawing, which is a temporary wall drawing, it's done with charcoal, he is in the earth, and he becomes this sort of seed bed of resistance and of renewal. So out of that body begins to grow this great tree, which is hanging the sword, the lamp, which is used by Harriet Tubman in many of the paintings, the light showing the way, the cup is in the background, and so you see, and you also see the leaning against the tree is the pike that he used, and in my work, it's something that he's always holding. The pike, this kind of brutal medieval weapon. It's blunt, and it's the thing he made to hand out because he knew it was more expedient than trying to get guns for everyone. It also, in this case, begins to grow leaves. The wood of the staff is alive. And I wanted to bring in all of these elements that are in the paintings into this wall drawing that now exists simply in this installation. And out of John Brown's body, comes this idea. Now, I don't think John Brown is some sort of messiah. I don't think he's some sort of he certainly is not the only one working, as shown in many of the other paintings. All the women who worked on the movement, all those who actually were enslaved, like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and many, many others, they did enormous work. But as a symbol, John Brown knew at some point that he was going to be more effective having been hung than had he succeeded at Harper's Ferry. And so this is this idea of where the John Brown, the person, almost becomes beside the point. The idea of laying your life on the line for others and in order to bring about a better world becomes what is most important. Still life with Scaffold is one of 3 of the still lifes that I did for the show. And on the table that's set in the foreground is the rope that you see and a bell. That the rope is, that's attached to the bell is also could be seen as the rope that's going to be on the scaffold. There's a signalman's lantern, and flying around are these woodpeckers, eastern woodpeckers, who are indigenous to that area, and they are there as this other life over the still life. And in the room that he's in, and it became a tent. I've talked about some of these other things, and this happens where you begin with one idea, but as you begin painting, the painting begins to talk back to you, and it begins to tell you what you should be doing. It said, there was a good idea you had at the beginning, but this is really what's happening. And I don't always know why that came to be, but I start to see a tent, and so it became a tent. And in the background is John Brown on he's wrapped up and he's on a cot. During the trial, he was injured really badly during the raid when he was captured, and so they brought him on this cot for his trial, and he would become so incensed that sometimes he'd stand up even though he's completely injured and rail against the jury and the judge and the lawyers. So there he is on his cot, and he's in the back of this tent. In the far ground, what we're looking at is the scaffold, and you could see the scaffold waiting for him, and then a forest fire. So again, as in all these paintings, there's the climate catastrophe coming in. There's a moment in John Brown's life, and then there's this foreground of the table, of the everyday, the now. So there's a quote by Frederick Douglass, a very famous quote from his lecture Pictures, that talks about poets and picture makers are the ones who can basically define reality. And I think one of the places where I really started with this body of work, sort of the entry point, before the entry point, the anteroom, the antechamber, before I got to actually the actual John Brownness of it, was making images about the Trump presidency, in the first 100 days, drawing his administration, drawing his face, and feeling despair, and just thinking about how this image world, which is that of the screen, of media, I just keep hitting it like this, and it's just, I don't know how to get around. It feels so present and all consuming, like it's just taking over. So I feel like I suddenly had this realization, like, this is paper thin. And just like water, if I dive into water as a belly flop, I could break my back. But if I understand that the image is just a paper thin surface of something much deeper, I can slice through it. And I can go deeper and then see the bigger, wider expanse of that. This little thing goes. So picture makers, image makers, are the ones who have to dive and cut through that surface. And they're the ones who have to bring up from the depths all the stuff that's there, the buried stuff, the forgotten stuff, the stuff that's pulsing at the bottom of the seafloor, and bring it up to the culture and shine a light and burn away this skin, which is wrapping us all and suffocating us. For Douglass, what he's talking about, and this is why he was so photographed and why he was so astute at how you present yourself, he understood, particularly in the beginning of a kind of national media age of the 19th century, he understood that if you are going to change, if you're going to fight the image of black men, of African Americans, of those who are enslaved, if you're going to fight that image, which are the lies and the prejudices that were in place because the racially biased system needs that there to keep the power structure in place, he knew you fight it with images. He knew that. And it can sound naive. I don't think art saves lives. I don't think a painting is going to save a life. But I do think if we tell the story, if we do these images that are complicated, these images aren't easily digested. These are images that I want you to spend some deep time with. I want you to kind of go inside you, and have something actually flourish. That is what these images. I think that's what he's talking about in that quote. So I guess what I had been thinking about since I started this project is through John Brown, through this historic figure, through these ideas that are out there that have been influencing us, that those in power keep trying to say, well, that was the past. They are alive, they're present, they're still hot, the embers still burn. And the way you excavate those, the way you blow on them so that they become a flame again, is that you do that through enlivening our image world. I don't know if I've done it. I don't know. That was my attempt anyway.